Medicine. It was autumn. In the small hours of the morning, the moon had gone down, but the sun had not yet risen, and the sky appeared a sheet of darkling blue. Apart from night prowlers, all was asleep. Old Chuan suddenly sat up in bed. He struck a match and lit the grease covered oil lamp, which shed a ghostly light over the two rooms of the tea house. Are you going now, Dad? Queried an old woman's voice, and from the small inner room a fit of coughing was heard. Old Chuan listened as he fastened his clothes, then stretching out his hand, said, Let's have it. After some fumbling under the pillow, his wife produced a packet of silver dollars, which she handed over. Old Chuan pocketed it nervously, patted his pocket twice, then lighting a paper lantern and blowing out the lamp, went into the inner room. A rustling was heard, and then more coughing. When all was quiet again, old Chuan called softly, Son, don't you get up. Your mother will see to the shop. Receiving no answer, old Chuan assumed his son must be sound asleep again. So he went out into the street. In the darkness, nothing could be seen but the grey roadway. The lantern light fell on his pacing feet. Here and there he came across dogs, but none of them barked. It was much colder than indoors, yet old Chuan's spirits rose, as if he had grown suddenly younger and possessed some miraculous life giving power. He had lengthened his stride, and the road became increasingly clear, the sky increasingly bright. Absorbed in his walking, old Chuan was startled when he saw the crossroad lying distinctly ahead of him. He walked back a few steps to stand under the eaves of a shop, in front of its closed door. After some time, he began to feel chilly. An old chap. Seems rather cheerful. Old Chuan started again and opening his eyes saw several men passing. One of them even turned back to look at him, and although he could not see him clearly, the man's eyes shone with a lustful light, like a famished person's at the sight of food. Looking at his lantern, old Chuan saw it has gone out. He patted his pocket. The hard packet was still there. Then he looked round and saw many strange people in twos and threes, wandering about like lost souls. However, when he gazed steadily at them, he could not see anything else strange about them. Presently, he saw some soldiers strolling around. The large white circles on their uniforms, both in front and behind, were clear even at a distance, and as they drew nearer, the dark red border could be seen too. The next second, with a trampling of feet, a crowd rushed past. Thereupon, the small group which had arrived earlier suddenly converged and surged forward. Just before the crossroad, they came to a sudden stop and grouped themselves in a semicircle. Old Chuan looked in that direction too, but could only see people's back, craning their necks as far as they would go. They looked like so many ducks, held and lifted by some invisible hand. For a moment all was still. Then a sound was heard and a stir swept through the onlookers. There was a rumble as they pushed back, sweeping past old Chuan and nearly knocking him down. Hey, give me the cash and I'll give you the goods. A man, clad entirely in black, stood before him, his eyes like daggers, making old Chuan shrink to half his normal size. This man was thrusting one huge extended hand toward him, while in the other he held a roll of steamed bread, from which crimson drops were dripping to the ground. Hurriedly, old Chuan fumbled for his dollars, and trembling he was about to hand them over, but he dared not take the object. The other grew impatient and shouted, "What are you afraid of? Why not take it?" When old Chuan still hesitated, the man in black snatched his lantern and tore off its paper shade to wrap up the roll. This package he thrust into old Chuan's hand, at the same time seizing the silver and giving it a cursory feel. Then he turned away, muttering, "Old fool! Whose sickness is this for?" Old Chuan seemed to hear someone ask, but he made no reply. His whole mind was on the package, which he carried as carefully as if it were the sole heir to an ancient house. Nothing else mattered now. He was about to transplant this new life to his own home and reap much happiness. The sun, too, has risen, lighting up the broad highway before him, which led straight home, and the worn tablet behind him at the crossroad, with its faded gold inscription, Ancient Pavilion. 2. When old Chuan reached home, the shop had been cleaned and the rows of tea tables were shining brightly. But no customers had arrived. Only his son was sitting at a table by the wall, eating. Beads of sweat stood out on his forehead. His lined jacket was sticking to his spine, and his shoulder blades struck out so sharply an inverted V seemed stamped there. At this sight, old Chuan's brow, which had been clear, contracted again. His wife hurried in from the kitchen, with expectant eyes and a tremor to her lips. Get it? Yes. They went together into the kitchen and conferred for a time. Then the old woman went out to return shortly with a dried lotus leaf which is spread on the table. Old Chuan unwrapped the crimson stained roll from the lantern paper and transferred it to the lotus leaf. Little Chuan had finished his meal, but his mother exclaimed hastily, "Sit still, little Chuan, don't come over here." Mending the fire in the stove, old Chuan put the green package and the red and white lantern paper into the stove together. A red black flame flared up, and a strange odor permeated the shop. "Smells good. What are you eating?" The hunchback had arrived. He was one of those who spend all their time in tea shops, the first to come in the morning and the last to leave. Now he had just stumbled to a corner table facing the street and sat down. But no one answered his question. Puffed rice gruel. Still no reply. Old Chuan hurried out to brew tea for him. "Come here, little Chuan." His mother called him into the inner room, set a stool in the middle, and sat the child down. Then, bringing him a round black object on a plate, she said gently, "Eat it up, then you'll be better." Little Chuan picked up the black object and looked at it. He had the oddest feeling, as if he were holding his own life in his hands. Presently he split it carefully open. From within the charred crust a jet of white vapors escaped, then scattered, leaving only two halves of a white flour steamed roll. Soon it was all eaten, the flavor completely forgotten, only the empty plate left. His father and mother were standing one on each side of him, their eyes apparently pouring something into him and at the same time extracting something. His small heart began to beat faster, and putting his hands to his chest, he began to cough again. Have a sleep, then you'll be all right, said his mother. Obediently, little Chuan coughed himself to sleep. The woman waited till his breathing was regular, then covered him lightly with a much patched quilt. 3. The shop was crowded, and old Chuan was busy, carrying a big copper kettle to make tea for one customer after another. But there were dark circles under his eyes. Aren't you well, old Chuan? What's wrong with you? Asked the greybeard. Nothing. Nothing? No, I suppose from your smile there couldn't be. The old man corrected himself. It's just that old Chuan's busy, said the hunchback, if his son. But before he could finish, a heavy jowled man burst in. He had over his shoulders a dark brown shirt, unbuttoned and fastened carelessly by a broad dark brown girdle at his waist. As soon as he entered, he shouted to old Chuan, Has he taken it? Any better? Luck is with you, old Chuan. What luck, if not for my hearing of things so quickly. Holding the kettle in one hand, the other straight by his side in an attitude of respect, old Chuan listened with a smile. In fact, all present were listening respectfully. The old woman, dark circles under her eyes too, came out smiling with a bowl containing tea leaves and an added olive, over which old Chuan poured boiling water for the newcomer. This is a guaranteed cure, not like other things, declared the heavy jowled man. Just think, brought back warm and eaten warm. Yes, indeed, we couldn't have managed it without Uncle Kang's help. The old woman thanked him very warmly. A guaranteed cure, eaten warm like this, a roll dipped in human blood like this, can cure any consumption. The old woman seemed a little disconcerted by the word consumption and turned a shade paler. However, she forced a smile again at once and found some pretext to leave. Meanwhile, the man in brown was indiscreet enough to go on talking at the top of his voice until the child in the inner room was woken and started coughing. So, you have had such a stroke of luck for your little Chuan. Of course, his sickness will be cured completely. No wonder old Chuan keeps smiling. As he spoke, the greybeard walked up to the man in brown and lowered his voice to ask, Mr. Kang, I heard the criminal executed today came from the Xia family. Who was it, and why was he executed? Who? Son of widow Xia? Of course, young rascal. Seeing how they were all haggling on his words, Mr. Kang's spirits rose even higher. His jowls quivered and he made his voice as loud as he could. The rogue didn't want to live, simply didn't want to. There was nothing in it for me this time. Even the clothes stripped from him were taken by Red Eye the jailer. Our old Chuan was luckiest, and after him, third Uncle Xia. He pocketed the whole reward, 25 taels of bright silver, and didn't have to spend a cent. Little Chuan walked slowly out of the inner room, his hands to his chest, coughing repeatedly. He went to the kitchen, filled a bowl with cold rice, added hot water to it, and sitting down started to eat. His mother, hovering over, asked softly, "Do you feel better, son? Still as hungry as ever?" "A guaranteed cure." Kang glanced at the child, then turned back to address the company. "Third Uncle Shia is really smart. If he hadn't informed, even his family would have been executed and their property confiscated. But instead, Silver, that young rogue, was a real scoundrel. He even tried to incite the jailer to revolt. No, the idea of it. A man in his 20s sitting in the back row expressed indignation. Red Eye went to sound him out, but he started chatting with him. He said the great Manchu Empire belongs to us. Just think, is that kind of talk rational? Red Eye knew he had only an old mother at home, but had never imagined he was so poor he couldn't squeeze anything out of him. He was already good and angry, and then the young fool would scratch the tiger's head. So he gave him a couple of slaps. Red Eye is a good boxer. Those slaps must have hurt. The hunchback in the corner by the wall exulted. The rotter was not afraid of being beaten. He even said how sorry he was. "Nothing to be sorry about in beating a wretch like that," said Greybeard. Kang looked at him superciliously and said disdainfully, "You misunderstood. The way he said it, he was sorry for Red Eye." His listener's eye took on a glazed look, and no one spoke. Little Chuan had finished his rice and was perspiring profusely, his head steaming. "Sorry for Red Eye, crazy. He must have been crazy," said Greybeard, as if suddenly he saw light. "He must have been crazy," echoed the man in his 20s. Once more, the customers began to show animation and conversation was resumed. Under cover of the noise, the child was seized by a paroxysm of coughing. Kang went up to him, clapped him on the shoulder, and said, "A guaranteed cure. Don't cough like that, little Chuan. A guaranteed cure." "Crazy," agreed the hunchback, nodding his head. 4. Originally, the land adjacent to the city wall outside the west gate had been public land. The zigzag path slanting across it, trodden out by passers-by seeking a shortcut, had become a natural boundary line. Left of the path, executed criminals or those who had died of neglect in prisons were buried. Right of the path were paupers' graves. The serried ranks of grave mounds on both sides looked like the rolls laid out for a rich man's birthday. The Qingming festival that year was unusually cold. Willows were only beginning to put forth shoots no larger than grains. Shortly after daybreak, old Chuan's wife brought 4 dishes and a bowl of rice to set before a new grave in the right section, and wailed before it. When she had burned paper money, she sat on the ground in a stupor as if waiting for something, but for what she herself did not know. A breeze sprang up and stirred her short hair, which was certainly whiter than in the previous year. Another woman came down the path, grey-haired and in rags. She was carrying an old round red lacquered basket with a string of paper money hanging from it, and she walked haltingly. When she saw old Chuan's wife sitting on the ground watching her, she hesitated and a flush of shame spread over her pale face. However, she summoned up courage to cross over to a grave in the left section where she set down her basket. That grave was directly opposite little Chuan's, separated only by the path. As old Chuan's wife watched the other woman set out 4 dishes and a bowl of rice, then stand up to wail and burn paper money, she thought. It must be her son in that grave too. The older woman took a few aimless steps and stared vacantly around. Then suddenly she began to tremble and stagger backwards. She felt giddy, fearing sorrow might send her out of her mind. Old Chuan's wife got up and stepped across the path to say quietly, "Don't grieve, let's go home." The other nodded, but her eyes were still fixed, and she muttered, "Look, what's that?" Looking where she pointed, old Chuan's wife saw that the grave in front had not yet been overgrown with grass. Ugly patches of soil still showed, but when she looked carefully, she was surprised to see at the top of the mound a wreath of red and white flowers. Both of them suffered from failing eyesight, yet they could see these red and white flowers clearly. There were not many, but they were placed in a circle, and although not very fresh, were neatly set out. Little Chuan's mother looked round and found her own son's grave, like most of the rest, dotted with only a few little pale flowers shivering in the cold. Suddenly she had a sense of futility and stopped feeling curious about the wreath. Meantime, the old woman had gone up to the grave to look more closely. "They have no roots," she said to herself. "They can't have grown here. Who could have been here? Children don't come here to play, and none of our relatives have ever been. What could have happened?" She puzzled over it until suddenly her tears began to fall and she cried aloud, "Son, they all wronged you, and you do not forget. Is your grief still so great that today you worked this wonder to let me know?" She looked all around but could see only a crow perched on a leafless bough. "I know," she continued, "they murdered you. But a day of reckoning will come. Heaven will see to it. Close your eyes in peace. If you are really here and can hear me, make that crow fly onto your grave as a sign." The breeze had long since dropped, and the dry grass stood stiff and straight as copper wires. A faint, tremulous sound vibrated in the air, then faded and died away. All around was deathly still. They stood in the dry grass, looking up at the crow, and the crow, on the rigid bough of the tree, its head drawn in, stood immobile as iron. Time passed. More people, young and old, came to visit the grave. Old Chuan's wife felt somehow as if a load had been lifted from her mind, and wanting to leave, she urged the other. "Let's go." The old woman sighed and listlessly picked up the rice and dishes. After a moment's hesitation, she started slowly off, still muttering to herself. What could it mean? They had not gone 30 paces when they heard a loud caw behind them. Startled, they looked around and saw the crow stretch its wing, brace itself to take off, then fly like an arrow towards the far horizon.